Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We have two student speakers, Kyoko Adachi and Joanne Nelson. Before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of these lands. So I would pass it on to Hadi now to introduce Kyoko.
Hi, everyone. 3 years ago, about this time, we were looking at the application packages for students who are going to come in and join us in September. And I saw this package from a student from Japan, and I was thinking, wow, wouldn't it be fun to work with Kyoko Adachi? And then I was thinking, and I'm sure she's going to work with Terry. And so how can I wangle myself into the supervisory committee of Kyoko? As it turned out, Kyoko, whose first degree was at University of Toronto and looks at issues in philosophy and so on, decided that Terry's plate was full, and I was fortunate enough and that Kyoko agreed to work with me because I thought she'd have so many better choices if she just looked around. Anyway, we've had an exceptionally fruitful collaboration, and Kyoko finished her degree in the midst of the pandemic shutdown, about, I think, what was it, about 20 months after you started, and has been continuing to collaborate from Japan. I should also add that I couldn't do this without Jia joining the supervisory committee for Kyoko, as we were kind of challenged by the way we'd gathered the data and needed to then analyze it, having gathered it in strange and mysterious ways. Anyway, without saying any further, I'll let Kyoko share the story with you.
All right, thank you, Hadi, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. It feels great to be back. I'm in Japan right now. It's 5 a.m., but I'm really thankful for the opportunity today. And yeah, because I didn't really have a chance to present my thesis to IRES due to COVID last year. So thank you for arranging this. Anyways, I'm going to share screen. Wait, I can't. You guys can see the desktop right now. Can you see my presentation slide?
That's good.
Yeah? Okay, good, sorry. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about my master's thesis today, which is titled On the Acceptance of Intergenerational Legacies, a comparison of Canada and Japan. I'd like to start by talking about the issue that motivated my research, which is that reaching a fair agreement in justice negotiations on a multi-generational issue is difficult. So a great example of this is climate change. Climate change, as we all know, is a multi-generational issue, and countries have been negotiating on how to address climate change in a way that is fair for everyone. To address the fairness, there is a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacity. This principle recognizes that all countries are responsible for any global environmental problem, but in different degrees according to their capacity and historical contribution. So although this principle sounds reasonable, its application to actual policies and agreements has been inconsistent and challenging, as we can see in the differences between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The reason for such difficulties is associated with the differences in how parties treat legacies of climate change. In particular, there are two issues. First, how should we treat a legacy with both positive and negative spillovers? So for example, climate change is a negative impact of industrialization, which also is associated with positive impacts in terms of economic development. So in negotiations, we hear developing countries claiming their right to development, while developed countries criticize the large greenhouse gas emissions produced by some of those developing countries. The second point of conflict is intentionality, or the fact that people in the past didn't know of the harmful effects of greenhouse gas emissions. So usually the year 1990 is considered as the point at which the harmful effects of greenhouse gas emissions were confirmed in the scientific community. And so on one side, usually developed countries claim that countries should not be blamed for emissions that they didn't know were harmful. And on the other side is nations claiming that all historical emissions should be counted. So our research looks at these failure of negotiations with a focus on cultural differences. Literature indicates that the failure of negotiations is partially due to cultural differences in norms regarding treatment of and obligations to legacies. So for example, the laws on inheritance succession differ across countries. In the common law, like most of Canada, the estate gets settled by an executor, and therefore the heir cannot inherit debts. However, in the civil law, the heir can inherit both inheritance and debt unless you renounce the right to succession. So this means that people have different expectations regarding how to deal with the debts from past generations. And this connects back to issue of intergenerational justice. And cultural differences also exist in how people weigh intent and outcome in moral judgment and blame attribution. So for example, studies show that North Americans tend to focus heavily on intent of an actor compared to a small-scale non-Western societies. There are also differences between how collectivist and individualist cultures trace responsibilities. So those with individualist cultures like North Americans look at individuals as an independent actor, while collectivist cultures like East Asians look at individuals as a part of group. Therefore, when East Asians are, for example, determining who has responsibility for an incident, for example, they focus more on the external factors, such as the role individuals play in a group. So our research objective is to understand how people from different cultures view and treat positive and negative legacies. In this study, we use inheritance and debt as an analogy for positive and negative legacies. Our research question is threefold. First, what factors are possible determinants of acceptance of inheritance and debt? Specifically, we looked at kinship distance, which is how close the deceased person was to you, amount of inheritance, means of wealth accumulation, and type of debt. We also looked at how these factors vary across cultures, and we identified if any traits were common across cultures. For each variable we tested, we had these different kinds of levels. So for kinship distance, we had close relative, distant relative, and stranger. We had we had three inheritance amount, 5,000, 50,000, and 500,000. Means of wealth accumulation were presented as occupation of the deceased based on the outcome and intent. So for example, positive outcome with intention was represented by a renewable energy inventor. And finally, we had four different types of debt. So debt to employee, bank, unpaid tax, and environmental fund. As for data collection, we conducted an online survey in Canada and Japan. You don't have to read through everything, but this is a screenshot from the actual survey. So the survey first presents a scenario in which a trusted lawyer informs the participants about an inheritance. And after the scenario is presented, participants are asked about their likelihood of inheritance acceptance under different conditions like kinship distance and amount. And the scenario is then expanded to suggest that there are also debts which amount to 50% of inheritance. And to mitigate any impact of legal differences between Canada and Japan, we specified that participants are not legally obligated to pay. In total, we collected 639 responses, of which 480 were Canadians and 159 were Japanese. So here it's important to note that we recruited participants differently for Canadians and Japanese. So for Canadians, we asked Qualtrics, a UBC survey tool, to distribute the survey to a Canadian representative sample based on gender and age. So these people are incentivized. For Japanese, however, we used snowball sampling. And so we sent emails to our friends and family who further distributed the survey to their friends and so on. So Japanese were not incentivized. And because of this difference in recruitment, we expect that Canadians and Japanese samples would be different, not only in terms of culture, which is what we're looking for, but also in many other sorts of characteristics. And so in order to account for the difference, we created a matched pair of samples based on gender, age, income, and education. So these are called matched Canadian sample and matched Japanese sample, and we use these samples specifically for analyzing cultural differences. Moving on to the results. First, in terms of effect of amount and kinship distance on acceptance of inheritance, we found that kinship distance matters, but amount doesn't. So this plot here shows the difference in acceptance of inheritance by the kinship distance from close relative to stranger. The sample CM means matched Canadian sample, and JM is matched Japanese sample. In both Canadian and Japanese samples, people were likely to accept from those closer to them. And we also found that compared to Canadians, Japanese are much less likely to accept inheritance from a distant relative and stranger. Second, when we asked whether learning about means of wealth accumulation changed the likelihood of inheritance acceptance, the majority of people answered that they will not change their initial decision to accept inheritance. So those people explained something like, how the money was earned has nothing to do with an inheritance. I don't care. And from the Japanese sample, it doesn't matter as long as it's not illegal. There are also people, more among Canadians, who said they would accept the money because they want to use it to compensate for the damage that the wealth created. So this is shown in orange pie. And an example of this is I can use the money to change the mistakes. One big difference here between Canadians and Japanese is, as you can see in yellow pies, more Japanese people answered that they are less likely or don't want to accept inheritance after learning about the means of wealth accumulation. So next is whether outcome and intent associated with wealth accumulation change the likelihood of inheritance acceptance. Our results indicated that people are less likely to accept inheritance if the wealth was associated with negative outcome and more likely if it's associated with positive outcome. And people mentioned that it felt better to accept money when person attended doing good for the world. I do not want to receive money that was earned through harming the earth. And also I would feel guilty if the money was made for socially unacceptable reasons. In terms of intent, however, we didn't really find any effect of intent on inheritance acceptance among both Canadians and Japanese. So for example, whether the negative outcome of inheritance was intentionally made or not didn't affect acceptance of inheritance. Next question is on acceptance of debt. The bars on the left show the number of respondents who accept inheritance from a close relative. So the leftmost bar means that initially 82 out of 93 respondents said they would accept inheritance from a close relative. And this didn't vary by culture. The middle bars show the percentage of people who accept inheritance after learning about that. So 67 out of 82 Canadian respondents said they would still accept, and the other 16 rejected the inheritance due to that. So when you compare the middle bars, you can see a lot more Japanese people decline the inheritance once they become aware of that. And their explanation tells us why this might be the case. So the Canadians who rejected the inheritance say things like, I do not want that to be a part of my history, and I would not want to
5
inherit
minutes
that.
remaining.
They simply don't want that. And we saw these kinds of responses among Japanese too, but Japanese mentioned more about not being able to trust a person. So I cannot accept inheritance if I don't know how the person lives. And also they voiced concerns about getting into troubles with other people. So these indicate that Japanese value trust, and it resonates with the results on kinship that we saw earlier, that Japanese were less likely to accept inheritance from a stranger. The right bars show how many of those who accept inheritance are willing to actually pay debt. And the rest are those who accept inheritance but would not pay debt. These people explained by saying it has nothing to do with me and why would I? As you can see, Japanese tend to pay back debt more than Canadians. So the common reasons mentioned by both Canadians and Japanese are that it's the right thing to do and I would feel guilty. One difference highlighted, however, between Canadian and Japanese explanation was that Japanese more frequently mentioned about the deceased. So for example, selling the debts would clear the deceased name, and sorting out inheritance does good for the deceased also. Next, does inheritance amount matter for how much debt people pay back? We found that inheritance amount matters for debt payment among Japanese, but not Canadians. And Japanese are more likely to pay back debt when the amount of inheritance was 50,000 and 500,000 compared to 5,000. We also asked participants how much debt they would pay off in case of 4 different types of debt. So the graph shows the percentage of debt payment in case of employee, bank, unpaid tax, and environmental fund. And our results demonstrate that employees paid back the most, while environmental fund is paid the least. Moreover, the effect of debt type on debt payment didn't vary between Canadians and Japanese. We also found that payment to environmental fund is most strongly associated with the amount of income and inheritance. This indicates that Canadians consider environment to be a luxury or something to be paid with a disposable income. And finally, our analysis on demographic factors showed 2 surprising results. First, women pay off more debt than men. And second, non-Judeo-Christians are more likely to pay off debt than Judeo-Christians. To summarize the findings, first, we saw that Canadians are more likely to accept inheritance than Japanese and care less about outcome. Second, outcome associated with the legacy matters, while intent does not. Japanese are more likely than Canadians to decline inheritance when debts are touched. And Japanese are more likely to settle a larger proportion of debts than Canadians, regardless of the type of debt. And finally, fifth, payment to environmental fund is most strongly associated with magnitude of inheritance. And finally, women and non-Judeo-Christians are more likely to pay off debt. So what do these results mean for climate change negotiations? How can we make use of these results? First, we learned that there are differences in how individuals from different cultural groups view and treat intergenerational legacies. So we can speculate that these differences at the individual level could be a reflection of how national representatives view their obligations to past and future generations in climate justice negotiations. So for example, our study demonstrates significant cultural differences in the acceptance of legacies. And this indicates that groups engaged in intergenerational justice negotiations may not share a common understanding of the notion of historical fairness. We also found that only outcome and not intent matters in the minds of the general public. And this suggests that there is a public support for accepting an earlier start to climate change obligations, meaning that their responsibility covers the emissions before 1990, when the scientific consensus was achieved. And third, we found that compensation depends on the nature of that. Therefore, framing climate change damages in terms of loss of livelihoods rather than loss of nature might attract more public support for compensation. And we hope that future research is conducted so that we can assess cross-cultural expectations about compensation, and we can further inform negotiation frameworks. I'd like to thank Hattie and Joanne, for my co-supervisors, for always giving insightful feedback and always supporting me through this research. I also want to thank Sonia for her great ideas that shaped my research in the beginning. Many people helped me with their feedback on the pilot surveys. And I want to thank my friends Hinako and Sho for translation of the survey. And finally, thank you to IRES, as well as UBC, CRC, NSF, and CDM for their financial support. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So as usual, students first. Ilke.
Hi, Kyoko. That was really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Maybe you mentioned this, so maybe I missed it, but I was wondering, when you sort of introduced the idea of debt, did you address, was this just like moral debt, or were there real consequences attached to not paying the debt back? And was this specified to the respondents?
Oh, right. So you were asking if there was any consequences attached to that if they didn't pay back. Right. Yeah. We specify that there is no legal or any obligations, as well as any consequences attached to that. So respondents were free to, accept or not.
Okay, so it's purely morally. Cool. Thank you.
Right. Hadi, you're on mute.
If no other students have any questions, Leila had a couple of questions in the chat line.
In the chat.
Yeah, nothing. That I was just curious how you set up some of these, because you dealt with a lot of different issues. And so I didn't know when the farmer was in the negative category, what that meant, or how the setup situated that in terms of what that meant. And then also, it sounds so much like a scam whenever you say inherit lots of money from a stranger. I just didn't know how you hedge that. So how do you address that by saying it's from a trusted lawyer in the setup? So it was more nuts and bolts questions, actually. Comments. Yeah. I mean, can you address the situating the farmer as negative, or how that was set up? Did you specifically say something about?
So for different means of wealth accumulation represented as occupations, we had descriptions. So I'm going to show you. So these are the descriptions that we had in the survey. So because farmer could be, it's for public, it might be hard to consider farmer as a negative, for climate change. So we described that the deceased was a farmer who didn't know agriculture harms biodiversity, and that's how we set up the 4 different means of wealth accumulation.
So in terms of a more substantive question, can you just say, you said your surprises, but in relation to the literature, were there any things that really surprised you in terms of cross-cultural differences around some of these issues?
Why don't you put up the summary tables, Kyoko?
Summary tables. Oh, the literature
comparison.
Right. So this is the table that has variables and what the literature said and what we found. So I think what was most striking for our research was that intent didn't matter. But in terms of cultural differences, I guess, well, we didn't really have like literature talking about debt and comparing cross-culturally inheritance debt. So I can't really say from the from the point of literature, but it was very striking that we saw Japanese pay back debt much more than Canadians, and I'd love to see if we did the same survey again, if we could find the same results or not.
Go to the next page quickly, and
sorry,
one last question.
Yeah, this is another variables that we.
There was another one, right? There you go. So I mean, the basic thing is there's very little literature on intergenerational responsibilities from the perspective of the inherited, the person who's the following generation, and this is addressing a whole area that was essentially unexplored. Terry, you have a question.
Yeah, I mean, I like this intergenerational responsibility idea, especially these days. But I wonder if people understood debt that way. Were there any comments that indicated that people were understanding debt as just sort of financial mismanagement as opposed to that intergenerational obligation and compensation for one generation's harms vis-a-vis another? Like any comments or feedbacks? You were showing some of those that really
Right.
helped us
We
understand that.
we actually didn't have any we didn't ask them to explain for each debt type or for each debt. So we don't have text entries from those.
You didn't have comment
yeah.
options there.
Mm-hmm. But we asked that question just to compare with their acceptance or inheritance, and we didn't really explore like compensation or if they think of it as a compensation or anything like that. So yeah.
Nice.
Yeah,
I mean,
we
the
did
debt side of it is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And can I ask one question, Hattie? Kyoko, so I found your results really fascinating, and it makes sense to me when I think about the things you found. And all of us are interested in the implications. And so you looked at Canada and Japan. What if you were to scale up and do all the world countries? Do you think you would see patterns there and ways in which we could use that information to actually have political decisions, make the correct changes?
That would be great to find out. But I think, well, because I'm framing this as East Asians and North Americans, and which is related to like collectivist and individualist, I assume or I expect if we were to scale up to more countries, we would see similar patterns like among Asians and North Americans. I hope those cultural differences, like implications of this research, we, can incorporate some of those cultural differences in terms of negotiations. But I'm still thinking of how actually that works. And it's really hard to imagine people understanding this and using this in reality right now for me. But Hattie can take on that if you want, because Hattie is like up for it.
So Terry has a couple of questions in the side, but I would basically say that initially when we were thinking about a title for our paper, it was International Negotiations Should Be by Young Women Who Are Not of Judeo-Christian Tradition. So that's what we found. Terry's questions are, what was the demographic filter used for creating the
weighted sample? You had a slide with 4 variables
right.
on that.
This is gender, age, income, and education.
Okay. I'm just wondering how you deal with, I mean, most of the sample would pick up a large urban sample in Canada. And your 2 largest cities are 60% and 40% not Canadian born. So,
right.
I mean,
so this is part of the limitation of the research because we couldn't account for the diversity within Canada. We had we created a variable called Judeo-Christian and non-Judeo-Christian, which is a general term that I created to account for like a small part of Canadian diversity. And we saw similar results there. But that's because Japanese is mostly non-Judeo-Christian. So
we're trying to redo the study with larger samples, both of them through Qualtrics. So if you have any suggestions, we'd welcome them. We're gonna get 400 and something samples for a Western and an Eastern culture. And so if you have any suggestions, we'd welcome them.
there are some protocols for that. I will send things offline.
Yeah, please send me. Yes.
Thanks, Kyoko.
If there are no other questions, we would love to pass it on to Joanne and Leila.
Great. Thank you, Kyoko, for the talk. That was great to hear. So I'm really pleased to introduce Joanne Nelson, who is a PhD candidate with us. Joanne is Tsimshian. She lives up the coast in her community in BC. And she'll be talking to us today about her PhD project, which is really interesting take at urban indigeneity and environmental stewardship, and specifically water stewardship, and especially looking at some arts-based practices, as you'll hear. Prior to doing her PhD with us, Joanne is one of those people that had a wealth of experience doing many other things. So her MA is in public health. She worked as an environmental health officer. She worked on reserve water and housing issues. She worked as an epidemiologist, looking at translating data for different First Nation communities. She worked as a program manager for CIHR and a number of other things. She's also, while at UBC, has been involved with the Canada-wide Decolonizing Water Project. And so it's been great to have Joanne with us, and it will be nice to hear again about her project. So thanks, Joanne.
Thank you, Layla. My name is Joanne Nelson. I'm Tsimshian Killer Whale Clan, and my Tsimshian roots are traced to Lachwalams, which is my mother's community, and Kitsimkalem, which is my father's community, and that's near Terrace. Lachwalams is a plane ride or a boat ride out of Prince Rupert. I currently live in Prince Rupert, and of course it's Tsimshian territory. I don't consider on and off reserve in that regard. And yeah, I'll get started with my presentation. And as Layla said, that I will be exploring urban Indigenous water knowledge and urban Indigenous water governance. And she is my co-supervisor along with Dr. Glenn Coulthard, and I am sponsored as a student by the Decolonizing Water Project, which is a SSHRC grant, and that's held through through a different university. My outline for my presentation, I'll briefly go over Indigenous ways of knowing water. I'll introduce the methodology I'll be using, which is Indigenous storytelling. I'll discuss the visual methodologies in Indigenous research. And exactly what do I mean when I talk about urban Indigenous water governance? What does that even mean? And my proposed research partners. Well, it's a partner at this point. They've gotten it down to one partner. For those of you who don't know where Prince Rupert is, if you look at Haida Gwaii and then draw a little line over to the mainland, that's where Prince Rupert is. It's right smack dab in my homelands of Tsimshian territory. On and off for 30 years, I lived in East Vancouver. That's Coast Salish territory. And in my research proposal, I called Vancouver Coast Salish Metro Vancouver, just to acknowledge that it is Coast Salish territory. First of all, when we talk about water and different ways of knowing water, there's multiple different ways of knowing water. And before I started this program, I really didn't give much thought to words like ontology and epistemology. Those were, I had not heard of those words until I started this program. I'm like, what does that even mean? So for those of you who are like me and didn't know what ontology and epistemology are, so ontology is concerned with what is true and what is real, what's the nature of reality, and epistemology is concerned with the nature of knowledge and the different methods of gaining knowledge. And those are obviously quite different between cultures, and between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. An example of different ways of knowing water. This is a great little book. I really love this book. It is Stories from the Magic Canoe of Wahide. It's a book where Cecil Paul, he's an elder, he was an elder from the Haisla Nation, and this documents his battle to protect the Kitlope, which is the watershed in his traditional territory. And it's a creative nonfiction by Brioni Penn. And he was doing a lot of great work to save the Kitlope, and it got the attention of a German filmmaker, and they came to film his activities as he fought to save his watershed. And the German filmmaker asked him, "What does the river mean to you?" And that's the Kitlope. And he explained it was the artery of Mother Earth. And that's another way of knowing water. And if you really think about how a river and the associated little streams and the deltas look from above. It does look like arteries going across the earth. Another way of knowing water, we often hear the term water is life from various water protection rallies and that sort of thing. And that was really came to the fore lately in the past 5 or 6 years with all of the water protection activities. And really, water does actually mean life in some Indigenous languages. Danica Littlechild, she's Cree, and in her Master of Law thesis, she breaks down the word water in Cree. It's nibi. It comes from nia, which means I am, or pi, Pimawatazin, which means life. So nibi means I am life. So literally in some Indigenous languages, when you say water, you are saying life. That water is life. The methodologies that I will be using is storytelling as a methodology. And that's really important to me as an Indigenous person, because when you think of all of our rich culture and our rich traditions, those are passed down in storytelling. And what better way to communicate that in the academy as using storytelling as a methodology? And that gets across our epistemologies and our ontologies. It's very decolonial, and it affords us the space to tell the stories in like a holistic way that is very interconnected with and within our cultures. So that is the methodology I'll be using. In terms of the specific method, for one part of my project, I'll be taking 2 different streams in my project. The main one will be a photo voice based project with people that I'll be partnering with. And what photo voice is, it's a qualitative methodology. It's been described as the most used method of arts-based research within Indigenous studies. And what it is that participants take a photo and tell their story behind a photo. They reflect on their community strengths. They promote critical dialogue as a group as they discuss their photos regarding the task at hand, regarding the research questions that they're going to investigate. And finally, they reach policymakers. It's very intentional in the photo voice method that the final step is to present their findings in sort of like an exhibit to policymakers, a presentation to policymakers, or reports that directly reach out to policymakers. For part of my comps, I looked at the different best practices of photo voice for use within Indigenous communities that I would like to take forward into my work. And I found that being intentional at the beginning of the study to ground the study in Indigenous cultural values is very important. To have an advisory committee from your community, and allow the process to be iterative. Allow there to be like extra time to have that back and forth, that conversation with the community, so that they can help direct what is going on in that project. And allow for time to be immersed in the community. So oftentimes for our people, Indigenous people, a lot of people just kind of parachute into the communities or helicopter in for, it's called helicopter research, that they come in and then they take off. And expand beyond photographs. So that's what I'll be doing, expanding beyond photographs and building a new theoretical framework. There's criticisms of photo voice too. It might be a little bit too popular. What about other arts-based methods and other ways of knowing? So what I'll be doing is expanding that to include other art forms that people might want to express themselves in, and like music, dance, literary arts, and that sort of thing. My theoretical framework, my theoretical framework is based on Indigenous standpoint theory, resurgence, and decolonization. So I think it's important for my project to center Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and knowledge creation and reporting of those knowledges into like a very Indigenous centered focus. My main research question will be, how can an Indigenous research paradigm that's built upon theoretical foundations of Indigenous resurgence, standpoint theory, and decolonization promote inclusion of urban Indigenous knowledge and voices in contemporary water governance debates? And I have sub-questions that will explore the use of the arts-based and qualitative methods, and exploring just an exploration of the wide variety of knowledges that are in Coast Salish Metro Vancouver. And then part of what I was saying is I'm going to expand photo voice to include other art forms. And just to give an example of what that could look like, this is a mask by Veronica Rose Wechter, and she is Gitxsan and grew up in Terrace, which is Tsimshian territory, very close to Gitxsan territory. This mask was part of an exhibition at Bill Reed Gallery called Women and Water. So this mask for her reflects on her knowledge and her connection to water. And you could read that on the right. So it's honoring and celebrating the sacred, nurturing women of this earth and water. And I think it's a beautiful mask, and it would be like a beautiful way to share with policymakers and the public of our traditional water knowledge. Another slide, the pendant on the left is something that I engraved myself. I'm an artist. I engraved this pendant. It has two salmon eggs in the middle, and on the outside is eelgrass, where salmon fry in estuaries kind of grow bigger and feed in the eelgrass before they head out to the open ocean. On the back it says Save Lilu, and that's referring to saving Lilu Island, which is in my traditional territory, and it was scheduled for development by Petronas, an LNG facility, and they were going to dredge up all the eelgrass and tried to sell us on their brand of science that said that the salmon fry would be fine without the eelgrass, which is ridiculous. A picture on the right is from the Vancouver Mural Festival. If you look up the Vancouver Mural Festival, if you Google it, there is an app. And in the app, they have a section on Indigenous artists and Indigenous artworks for the Vancouver Mural Festival. I'll be interviewing the Indigenous artists for a podcast. That'll be one of my outputs, and just exploring what their mural means in terms of traditional knowledge, especially if it's water knowledge, and how that can be helpful in contemporary water debates, and just how that is communicated in a very real way in the urban, which is often being portrayed as a white space, a place for white people and modernity, as opposed to Indigenous traditional knowledge. Why urban Indigenous? Why am I interested in that, other than the fact that, you know, I lived in Vancouver for 30 years? 5 minutes? Thank you. I lived in East Vancouver for 30 years and saw a lot of change, a lot of culture making, a lot of community making. I myself was in, my dance group, an urban traditional dance group, for over 20 years. I come at it as a lot of Indigenous scholars come at it from, that all land is Indigenous land. It doesn't matter if there's a city on top of it, it's still Indigenous land. And it counters notions that Indigenous cultures and lifeways are inconsistent with the city. And I just think that there's like I said, there's been so much going on in the cities that I've seen in terms of culture making and passing on traditional knowledge. So what does that look like even? That seems like such an abstract concept. Is it rooted in Coast Salish law? Are we asking for a seat at the table? Are we asking to be recognized? Um, what does it look like? How are we expressing our sovereignty? How are we expressing our ties to water and what that means to us in the city? And oftentimes it could look like direct action to support our sacred responsibility to water, such as rallies, which are often called protests, to protect other Indigenous nations' water and land rights. Like the Unistoten rally here in 2019 in Vancouver that I attended. And one of the Indigenous speakers said that this is water governance. Us coming together to protect the water of other nations is water governance in the city. My proposed research partner will be Native Education College. Like I said, I'm teaching there in the Indigenous Land Stewardship program right now, and I'm having a great time doing it. Yes, thank you. Any questions? I had to really pick it up at the end there. Thank you.
So we'll go for a couple of student questions first. Thanks, Joanne.
Okay. Thank you for all the virtual claps.
We have a raised hand. I'm not seeing, but maybe just unmute yourself.
I have a question I'd like to ask. Hi, Joanne. Sure. I wonder sort of what you think, or what, I know you're sort of building a bit of a new framework in terms of urban Indigenous water governance. And I just wonder if you can say a little bit more about what you think that actually might look like, given that we don't, I think so much about water governance in the urban space. I mean, I know we do, but yeah. From an Indigenous perspective, I wonder if you might just elaborate a little bit about what you think that might end up looking like through your research, though I know you haven't
For
done
sure.
it yet.
I think when I think about it, I think of really something like, I mean, this could be a whole chapter, is my sister. Well, I call her my sister. She's my first cousin, but in our culture, she's my sister. She's been the leader of our dance group for over 20 years. So she's very much involved in culture making in the city, and bringing in language teachers for us, art teachers, making regalia and participating in sharing our culture. And she also spearheaded a lot of the efforts for saving Lilu Island, and also spoke at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And on Lilu Island, there's now a totem pole there that tells the story of the traditional landowners of Lilu Island. And it was carved by my friend Phil Gray. He's Tsimshian and he's urban. And he grew up in the city. He grew up in East Vancouver, never lived, in Tsimshian territory, yet we all find a way to find each other in the city and to fulfill this responsibility that we have for water. And I think that what you'll find is that we all see ourselves as interconnected up and down the coast, and across Turtle Island, but especially up and down the coast, we have a lot of kinship ties with Coast Salish people. Vancouver's always been a gathering place, a special gathering place for Indigenous people. And I think those are the kinds of things that will be reflected, is that when we're in the city, we don't lose that connection with the land. It just looks a bit different. And the way we express it is a bit different. Yeah.
Do we have one more question from a student, please?
Oh, thank you, Terry, for putting the link in.
Welcome. No, that's a great festival, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, a little bit more about that mural that I put up. It's by Ronnie Dean Harris, and it shows sturgeon. And it's in False Creek. And False Creek, of course, before it was paved over, was quite a rich area for sturgeon. And if you go to the Vancouver Mural Fest and read about these murals, Ronnie Dean Harris mentions that the sturgeon story is the story of a woman who loved the water so much she became a sturgeon. So I think it's important, like, hopefully I can interview him for my podcast and ask, what does that mean moving forward for water governance? Like, what do you want people to know about water as they walk along this, so-called developed area now and think about what does it mean to protect water?
Does anyone else have a question? If not, I'll just ask something. Joanne, in terms of specific issues in the urban context in a place like Vancouver, are issues around, daylighting streams or any of those issues around salmon streams or anything coming up so far, or do you expect that to be something of interest?
I hope that they do come up because I'm doing like hosting a webinar through decolonizing water, and I have some people chosen to be on that panel, and one of the people specifically looks for water to pray over in the city and to do tobacco offerings, and she's not from Vancouver, she's from another nation. But yeah, things like that I think will come up, that when other people from other nations will pray for the water that's in the city already. Yeah.
We have a question from Andrea Reed. Nice to meet you, Andrea.
Hi, Lula. Nice to meet you too. I'm a new faculty member here, Joanne, in the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, and I'm a citizen of the Niska Nation, so a neighbor up north. But first of all, I just want to commend you. This is an amazing project, and I'm really excited to follow you as you move through it. One question I have for you is just in relation to the action piece of there's so much scope within this for this to contribute to ongoing efforts with the Water Life movement and the rallies that you mentioned already. Where do you see some of these outputs kind of going towards? Would you ever think about exhibiting some of the works that are produced? And I also am curious about if there's room for poetry in all of this, as many of our nation members are active in that space too.
For sure. And I was running out of time, so I just burst through what I could. But when I'm reimagining photo voice, yes, I do want to include poetry. And one of the people that's going to be on the webinar that I'm going to be hosting with Decolonizing Water is JB, the First Lady. She's a rapper and a slam poet and a poet, and a lands protector and a water protector and an activist. So that will be very much welcome in the project that I'll be doing. And it will be with students from Native Education College. And if there's not enough participants, then it'll be snowball sampling and opening up to the larger urban Indigenous community by, like promoting it through Facebook and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to follow up with you because I have
good.
so many other things.
I hope you do. Yes, I look forward to it. Yeah.
And we'll make sure to advertise the webinar, which will be around World Water Day. To everybody in case they'd like
it's coming up pretty quick. I got to nail down everyone's availability. Andrew, you have a question.
Yeah, hi, Joanne. I'm also fascinated by your topic and your approaches. One thing I'm really conscious of in Vancouver is how much of the water that used to flow through the forest is now buried underground.
Yes.
Go through culverts. And I think there's a real disconnect from the way the world used to be here, as we've sort of buried a lot of the natural process. I'm wondering, through your research, can you help expose that, or maybe even identify places where we could re-expose the water and have a stronger connection to it?
Exactly. And I think that's part of the mural festival is really important in that, because of the murals, some of the ones that you can see on Vancouver Mural Festival, you can scroll through the Indigenous section, and some of them do specifically mention water. And for me, I like, as a storytelling, that cities are predicated on a white spatial imaginary, very much like an abstract space versus how we as Indigenous people imagine the space. Like, I imagine Vancouver as a place of Indigenous gathering that's always been important to the coast, right? And hopefully that comes through in the webinars that we could maybe cross promote that with the Vancouver Mural Festival app to let people know that, you know, you are on Indigenous land, for one. These places still exist. Maybe some of these places are like, you know, underground or under pavement at the moment, but maybe promote Indigenous futurisms that will see some of these waters being daylighted again and protected. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one last question? If anyone has a comment or question for Joanne?
Oh, Hadi's got a good comment. Thanks.
Yeah, you know, there was a set of maps that I saw once at the Carnegie Center on surfacing water. And I think they came out of that work in the, you know, in the old P&E grounds.
Oh, wow.
I'll ask around, see if
Oh,
those
yeah,
are around.
please
It was
do,
probably
yeah.
10 years ago now that I saw that.
Yeah.
They were up on the wall there. They were pretty great.
Perfect. And Daisy has a question.
Hi, Joanne. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I don't know too much about it, but I'm just really happy to be here and to listen to you talk and learn more. So I had a question about the daylighting that was brought up. Some of the people that I've talked to that have talked about daylighting, a lot of it comes from more human-centric ways of knowing the land and knowing the water, which is very different from maybe some of the perspectives that you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, like, for example, a lot of the streams have been daylighted for stormwater drainage, or specifically for salmon return. What are your thoughts on that? And how do you think that Indigenous voices can be heard more in more municipal and policymaking in order to make that a little bit less human-centric?
Exactly. And I think it's really important to bring that up because, like I said, I started off with the different ways of knowing water in terms of epistemology and ontology. And also, if we look at things like legal pluralism, there's Indigenous laws that state how we should treat water. So what I like to look at is other examples like the Cowichan Watershed Society or the Cowichan Watershed Board, and it is co-managed equally, chaired through the Cowichan Band and through like the municipal area, I think, town of Cowichan. Like,
EVRD, which is,
yeah. So it's equally chaired between an Indigenous group and a non-Indigenous group. And they decide together how to address all of these issues in the watershed. So I think if they had something like that in Vancouver, that would be fabulous. And it would also be fabulous when you're looking at things like Indigenous knowledge. There's a wealth of a diverse range, I think, of Indigenous knowledges to be explored in the city because we have so many different nations represented in the city. For example, if we're worried about, if things like daylighting of the streams, maybe there are people that are urban that are experienced in that. Maybe they've have connections to other nations that have experienced that and they could help with that. But I hope that answers your question. Co-management is basically what I'm looking at.
Right, great, thank you so much.
I think we're exactly on time. Rudri, did you want to close us or?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kyoko and Joanne, for those wonderful presentations. And see you all next Thursday.
Thanks very much, both of you.
Everyone,
Okay.
I put my email in there. Talks at noon, Andrea. Thank you.